The police arrived first. Then came the reporters. Within an hour, satellite news vans had completely blocked Cedar Lane. Neighbors stood on their front lawns, whispering the same question: what is Jack Sullivan hiding? By that afternoon, there wasn't a single house left for sale on the entire street. Every property had been purchased by the same man, a quiet mechanic who had spent most of his life fixing old pickup trucks in a small garage less than 2 miles away. No one understood how he suddenly had that kind of money. No one understood why he refused every interview. No one understood why every family that sold their house walked away smiling through tears. The rumors spread faster than the facts. Some people believed Jack was secretly working for a billionaire developer. Others claimed the neighborhood was about to be demolished. A few even insisted the government had discovered something buried beneath Cedar Lane. Then something happened that made the mystery even stranger. Instead of moving into any of the houses he bought, Jack left every single one completely untouched. The lights stayed off. The curtains never moved. The mailboxes remained empty. It looked like an entire neighborhood had simply frozen in time. 3 days later, the truth came out, and millions of people across America realized they had judged the wrong man. Because Jack Sullivan wasn't buying houses to make money. He was trying to keep a promise that had been made 30 years earlier, a promise that everyone else had forgotten. But before we tell you why one man spent his entire fortune buying an entire neighborhood, you need to understand what Cedar Lane looked like before everything changed. Because without that, nothing you're about to see will make sense. If you enjoy neighborhood mysteries with unforgettable, emotional endings, make sure you subscribe before we begin. Every week, we bring you stories that remind us how quickly appearances can deceive us and how one decision can change countless lives. Now tell me something in the comments. What city are you watching from today? I read as many comments as I can, and I love seeing people joining us from all over the world. Now imagine this. You wake up one morning, walk outside, and discover that your quiet neighbor has somehow bought every single house on your street. Would you feel curious, confused, or afraid? That's exactly how the people of Cedar Lane felt. What they didn't know was that the answer had nothing to do with greed, nothing to do with power, and everything to do with love, loyalty, and one promise that refused to die. Let's go back 6 months earlier, because that's where this unforgettable story truly begins. 6 months earlier, Cedar Lane was the kind of street people dreamed of living on. Tree-lined sidewalks, children riding bicycles, neighbors waving as they collected the morning newspaper, summer barbecues, Christmas lights stretching from porch to porch every December. People often joked that nothing exciting had ever happened there. They couldn't have been more wrong. At the very end of the street stood Sullivan Auto Repair, a small garage that had been there for almost 40 years. It wasn't modern. It wasn't flashy. The sign was faded. The paint was peeling. And the owner never advertised. Yet every morning before sunrise, customers were already waiting outside. Not because Jack Sullivan was the cheapest mechanic, because everyone trusted him. Jack was 63 years old, broad shoulders, calloused hands, gray beard, the kind of face that looked permanently serious until someone made him laugh. He rarely spoke more than necessary. He wasn't unfriendly. He simply believed actions mattered more than words. If a struggling single mother couldn't afford to repair her car, sometimes the invoice mysteriously disappeared. If an elderly veteran needed transportation for a hospital appointment, Jack fixed the truck and quietly refused payment. If a college student broke down hundreds of miles from home, Jack often stayed late into the night just to make sure they got back safely. He never told anyone, and the people he helped almost never did either. That was simply who he was. Yet very few people actually knew him, because Jack never attended neighborhood parties, never joined community meetings, never posted on social media, never explained his past. Rumors filled this silence. Some believed he had once been incredibly wealthy. Others insisted he had served in the military. A few claimed he had lost his entire family decades ago. No one knew which stories were true, not even Jack's closest customers. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning, everything changed. A sleek black SUV pulled into the garage. It looked completely out of place among dusty pickup trucks and work vans. The driver stepped out wearing an expensive tailored suit. He wasn't there for an oil change. He wasn't there because his vehicle was broken. He walked directly toward Jack. "I've been looking for you." Jack looked up from beneath the hood of an old Ford pickup. His expression changed instantly. Not fear, recognition. "You found me." The man handed Jack a thick envelope. "I promised your father I'd deliver this, no matter how long it took." Without another word, he returned to the SUV and drove away. Every mechanic in the garage stopped working. They had never seen Jack speechless before. For nearly a full minute, he simply stared at the envelope. His hands trembled. Finally, he carried it into his tiny office and quietly locked the door. No one saw him for the rest of the afternoon. The next morning, Jack didn't open the garage. For the first time in almost 4 decades, the lights stayed off. Customers arrived and waited, then waited longer. By noon, people began calling his phone. No answer. The following day, the garage was still closed. On the third day, a handwritten sign appeared on the front door. Closed until further notice. No explanation, no date, no signature. Just those 4 words. Speculation spread through Cedar Lane faster than wildfire. Some believed Jack was seriously ill. Others thought he had retired without telling anyone. Then another rumor began circulating. Someone claimed they had seen Jack meeting with real estate agents. Another neighbor insisted he had visited the county records office. A week later, the first house on Cedar Lane was sold. Cash offer. No negotiations. The buyer's name shocked everyone. Jack Sullivan. At first, people laughed. What does a mechanic want with an old house? Then a second house sold. Then a third. Then another. Within weeks, the entire neighborhood realized something impossible was happening. Jack Sullivan wasn't buying one property. He was quietly buying the entire street. And no one, not the neighbors, not the real estate agents, not even the families selling their homes, could explain why. But hidden inside the envelope that mysterious man had delivered was a letter written 30 years earlier, a letter that contained one impossible request. A request Jack had promised he would never ignore. And honoring that promise was about to cost him everything he had ever built. Jack didn't open the envelope right away. For nearly an hour, it remained on the corner of his old wooden desk while he sat in complete silence. Outside, customers kept arriving at the garage. Engines started. Tools clanged against concrete. Mechanics called his name, but Jack heard none of it. He couldn't stop staring at the faded handwriting across the front. It read only 4 words. "For my son, Jack." The handwriting belonged to his father, a man who had died 30 years earlier. Slowly, Jack unfolded the yellowed letter. The paper was fragile. The ink had faded, but every word felt as if it had been written the day before. "Jack, if you're reading this, it means Thomas Reed finally found you." Jack immediately remembered the name. Thomas had once been his father's closest friend. After decades of silence, he had kept his promise. The letter continued. "There is something I never told you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted you to build your own life before carrying my burden." Jack's hands tightened around the paper. 30 years ago, Cedar Lane was almost destroyed, not by a fire, not by a storm, but by greed. Jack frowned. He had lived on Cedar Lane most of his life. He had never heard this story. A development company wanted every house on the street. Families were pressured to sell. Some were threatened. Others accepted offers because they had no choice. Your mother and I gathered the neighbors together. We made a promise. No family would ever lose their home because of money again. Jack stopped reading. His father had never spoken about any of this. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "I failed." Jack closed his eyes. "I couldn't save them." People moved away. The neighborhood was broken apart. "Before I died, I made Thomas promise that if one day you are able, you would finish what I couldn't." Jack turned the page. Attached to the final sheet was a folder containing legal documents, old property records, maps, and one handwritten list. Every original family that had once lived on Cedar Lane. Some names had check marks. Others had question marks. Many had handwritten notes beside them. Still alive, moved to Texas, lost contact, looking for family. Jack's father had spent years trying to keep track of every neighbor, even after they had left. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence. "A neighborhood isn't made of houses. It's made of people who refuse to abandon one another." Jack leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he cried. Not because of the money, not because of the impossible task, but because he finally understood why his father had worked so hard every day of his life. The garage had never been about repairing cars. It had been about helping neighbors, just as his father had done before him. Late that evening, Jack drove slowly through Cedar Lane. He parked at the end of the street, turned off the engine, and simply watched. Children laughed in front yards. Neighbors walked their dogs. An elderly couple watered flowers together. Everything looked peaceful. But Jack now knew something no one else did. A massive investment corporation had quietly begun buying land just outside the neighborhood. Soon, property values would skyrocket. Taxes would follow. Many long-time residents, especially retirees and working families, would eventually be forced to sell. History was preparing to repeat itself, unless someone stopped it. Jack looked down at his father's letter one last time, then whispered quietly to himself, "I'll finish what you started." The following morning, he visited the first homeowner, not with pressure, not with fear, but with an unexpected offer. "I'd like to buy your house, but only if you agree to keep living in it." The elderly couple looked at him in complete confusion. Jack smiled. "You'll stay here. You'll pay $1 a year in rent, and this will always be your home." Neither of them believed what they were hearing. They thought it had to be a joke, but Jack wasn't joking. He was beginning to build something far bigger than anyone on Cedar Lane could imagine. Unfortunately, someone else had already noticed what Jack was doing, and unlike Jack, they weren't trying to save the neighborhood, they were trying to own it. Across town, inside the glass offices of Blackstone Urban Development, a wealthy executive looked at a map of Cedar Lane. Every property Jack had purchased was highlighted in blue. The executive smiled coldly, so he finally opened the letter. Then he picked up the phone. "Don't let Jack Sullivan buy another house, whatever it costs." At that moment, Jack had no idea that keeping his father's promise had just made him the target of people with far more money and far fewer morals. Jack had expected resistance. He had expected questions. He had even expected people to reject his offers. What he hadn't expected was a carefully planned campaign designed to destroy his reputation. 3 days after purchasing the Ford house, anonymous flyers appeared in every mailbox on Cedar Lane. There were no names, no signatures. Only one message printed in bold black letters. "Why is Jack Sullivan buying your neighborhood?" Below it were accusations. "Developers never buy houses one at a time. Someone is lying. Ask yourself what they're hiding." By sunset, photographs of Jack were circulating on local community Facebook groups. A blurry picture showed him leaving a meeting with a real estate attorney. Another showed him standing outside the county records office. The captions told a story that wasn't true. "The mechanic is secretly working for investors. Families are being tricked into selling. Your home could be next." Fear spread faster than facts. Neighbors who had trusted Jack for years suddenly stopped waving. People who once greeted him every morning crossed the street to avoid him. Customers canceled appointments at the garage. One review after another appeared online. "Don't trust this man. He's pretending to help people. He's destroying Cedar Lane." Jack read every comment, then quietly closed the laptop. His younger mechanic, Daniel, looked furious. "We should sue them." Jack shook his head. "No, they're afraid." And frightened people believed the loudest voice. The attacks became more personal. One evening, someone spray-painted a single word across the garage door: greed. Daniel grabbed a bucket and hurried outside. Jack stopped him. "Leave it." Daniel stared at him. "You want everyone to see that?" Jack nodded. "I want them to remember what fear looks like." The next morning, television reporters arrived. Microphones surrounded him before he even reached the garage door. "Mr. Sullivan, are you forcing families out of Cedar Lane? Who is financing your purchases? Are you working for Blackstone Urban Development?" Jack answered only one question: "I'm trying to keep my promise." The reporters immediately asked another: "What promise?" Jack remained silent, because revealing the letter would expose families his father had protected decades earlier. Some promises couldn't be explained. They had to be honored. That evening, a town hall meeting was held inside the local community center. Nearly every resident attended. The atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a neighborhood gathering. People shouted, accused, interrogated one another. Finally, Someone stood and pointed directly at Jack. "If you're such a good man, tell us why you're buying our homes." The room became completely silent. Everyone waited. Jack slowly stood. He looked around the room. Many of the faces staring back at him had known him for decades. Some had trusted him with their cars. Others had invited him to weddings, birthday parties, holiday dinners. Now, most looked at him with suspicion. Jack took a deep breath, then quietly said, "If I tell you today, you'll lose something far more valuable than your houses." No one understood what he meant. The silence only made people angrier. One by one, neighbors walked out. Some shook their heads. Others whispered that Jack had finally revealed his true character. Within 24 hours, 3 more families refused his offers. 2 canceled signed agreements. Another placed a large sign in the front yard, "Not for sale to Jack Sullivan." Across town, inside the offices of Blackstone Urban Development, the company's executives celebrated. Their plan was working perfectly. If the neighborhood turns against him, he'll never finish buying the street. But they overlooked one important detail. Jack had never started this fight for recognition. He had started it because of a promise. And people willing to sacrifice everything for a promise rarely quit when life becomes difficult. Late that night, Jack unlocked the old storage room behind his garage. Dust covered everything inside. Old toolboxes, broken engines, wooden shelves. At the very back of the room sat an old cedar chest that hadn't been opened in decades. Inside were dozens of photo albums, newspaper clippings, cassette tapes, letters, and one old VHS tape with a handwritten label. Cedar Lane, July 14, 1996. Jack stared at it for several seconds, then smiled. "For 30 years you've been waiting." The next morning, he drove to the only person in town who still owned a working VHS player. As the tape began to play, Jack's eyes filled with tears. Everything his father had written was true, but the recording revealed something even more shocking. Someone else had witnessed the promise. Someone powerful. Someone whose testimony could expose Blackstone forever. And that person was still alive. They had been silent for 30 years, until now. Jack barely slept that night. The old VHS tape sat on the passenger seat of his truck as he drove across town before sunrise. He kept replaying one image in his mind, a younger version of his father standing in the middle of Cedar Lane, surrounded by frightened families, asking them to make a promise that would outlive every one of them. The tape had captured more than memories. It had captured the truth. When Jack finally found someone with a working VHS player, the screen flickered to life. The video quality was poor. The colors were faded, but the voices were unmistakable. There was his father. There were the original families. And standing near the back of the crowd was a woman holding a folder of official documents. Jack froze. He recognized her immediately, Margaret Ellis. She had once been the town clerk. Now she was 84 years old and living quietly in a retirement community nearly 40 miles away. Jack drove there without hesitation. When Margaret opened the door, she stared at him for several long seconds before smiling sadly. "I was wondering when that letter would finally find you." Jack felt a chill run through his body. "You knew?" She nodded. "I helped your father write it." For the next 2 hours, Margaret told Jack everything. 30 years earlier, Blackstone Urban Development had tried to pressure dozens of families into selling their homes far below market value. Many residents were elderly. Others had nowhere else to go. Some had lived on Cedar Lane for generations. Jack's father organized the neighborhood, convinced that if they stood together, no one would lose their home. But powerful people wanted the street. Threats followed. Lawsuits appeared. Jobs were lost. Families became frightened. Little by little, the neighborhood fell apart. Jack's father blamed himself for the rest of his life. Before he died, he asked Margaret and Thomas Reed to protect the documents until the right moment came. Margaret slowly opened an old wooden cabinet. Inside were dozens of folders, original contracts, letters, property maps, signed statements, and one document that made Jack's heart race. A confidential agreement proving Blackstone had secretly planned to force homeowners out long before anyone knew about the development project. "This," Margaret whispered, "is what your father wanted the world to see." Jack carefully gathered every document. He finally had proof. Proof that his father had been telling the truth. Proof that Blackstone's campaign wasn't new. It had simply waited 30 years for another chance. News of Jack's meeting spread quickly. By evening, television crews were parked outside the retirement community. Reporters demanded answers. Neighbors watched from their living rooms. For the first time since the rumors began, people were no longer asking what Jack was hiding. They were asking what Blackstone had hidden. 2 days later, Cedar Lane's community hall filled once again. This time, every seat was taken. Families who had refused to speak to Jack now sat quietly, waiting. Margaret slowly walked onto the stage. She carried the same folder she had protected for 3 decades. The room became silent. She described the threats, the secret meetings, the false promises, the pressure placed on families who simply wanted to keep their homes. Then she held up the original agreement signed by Blackstone executives. Gasps filled the room. Several neighbors began crying. Everything Jack had endured suddenly made sense. The anonymous flyers, the online rumors, the television attacks. It had all been part of the same strategy. Destroy the one man standing in the way. Jack was invited to speak. He stepped to the microphone. His voice remained calm. "I never wanted your houses." He paused. "I wanted your families, to keep them." The room fell completely silent. He continued. "My father believed that a neighborhood isn't measured by property values. It's measured by the people who choose not to leave each other behind." Many neighbors lowered their heads. Some couldn't even look at him. One by one, families stood. An elderly widow walked toward Jack first. "I'm sorry." Another neighbor followed, then another. Within minutes, nearly everyone in the room was standing, not to accuse him, but to thank him. Outside the building, Blackstone executives watched the meeting from inside a black SUV. Their plan was collapsing. One executive quietly spoke into his phone. "If the neighborhood unites, we lose everything." The man on the other end replied with a sentence that made the situation even more dangerous. "Then make sure Jack never finishes what he started." At that exact moment, Jack received a phone call. One of the homes he had already purchased was on fire, and an elderly couple was still inside. The moment Jack saw the flames, he slammed on the accelerator. Black smoke rolled into the night sky, visible from blocks away. Neighbors rushed from every direction. Some carried buckets. Others shouted for help. Sirens echoed through Cedar Lane. But Jack wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at the front window. The elderly couple who lived there, Harold and Evelyn, were still trapped inside. Without thinking twice, Jack jumped out of his truck. A firefighter grabbed his arm. "Sir, it's too dangerous." Jack looked at the burning house. Their family. Before anyone could stop him, he ran straight through the front door. The heat was unbearable. The ceiling groaned above him. Smoke filled every room. He covered his mouth with his sleeve and called their names. No answer. Then a faint voice. "Jack." He followed the sound to the back bedroom. Harold had fallen while trying to help Evelyn. Neither of them could reach the door. Jack lifted Harold onto one shoulder, helped Evelyn to her feet, and slowly guided them toward the hallway. At that exact moment, part of the ceiling collapsed behind him. The crowd outside gasped. Seconds later, Jack emerged from the front door with both of them safely beside him. The entire street erupted into applause. Some neighbors cried openly. Others simply stood in silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The same man they had accused of destroying their neighborhood had just risked his life to save 2 of its oldest residents. As firefighters brought the blaze under control, investigators made an unexpected discovery. The fire had not started by accident. Evidence pointed to deliberate arson. Within 48 hours, surveillance footage from a nearby business revealed a vehicle linked to contractors secretly hired by Blackstone Urban Development. The investigation moved quickly. Search warrants followed. Emails were uncovered. Financial records exposed illegal payments. Executives who had spent decades manipulating communities were finally held accountable. The company withdrew every remaining project connected to Cedar Lane. For the first time in 30 years, the neighborhood no longer lived under the shadow of losing its homes. But Jack wasn't interested in headlines. He quietly returned to the garage. He reopened the old doors, picked up his worn tools, and went back to repairing cars as if nothing extraordinary had happened. A week later, something unforgettable took place. Every family on Cedar Lane gathered in the center of the street. Long wooden tables stretched from one end of the block to the other. Children laughed. Neighbors embraced. Music filled the evening air. At sunset, Margaret Ellis stood beside Jack and handed him a small wooden box. Inside was his father's old pocket watch, along with one final letter. Jack unfolded it with trembling hands. "If this day ever comes, it means you succeeded where I could not. Never forget that houses grow old, but kindness can outlive generations." Jack closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked around, the families, the home. The street that refused to disappear. His father's promise had finally been fulfilled. Months later, Jack completed the purchase of the final house on Cedar Lane. Not to own the neighborhood, but to place every property into a permanente community trust. A legal agreement ensured that no outside corporation could ever force families from their homes again. The houses would belong to the people who lived in them, exactly as his father had dreamed. Years passed. Visitors still came to Cedar Lane, not because of the fire, not because of the investigation, but because people had heard about a neighborhood that chose compassion over fear. Near the entrance of the street stood a simple wooden sign. It read, "A neighborhood is not built with houses, but with people who refuse to abandon one another." Every newcomer stopped to read it, and every longtime resident smiled, because they knew the story behind those words. The story of one quiet mechanic who kept a promise the whole world had forgotten. If this story reminded you that kindness is stronger than rumors, we'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you were Jack? Share your answer in the comments. And tell us, what city are you watching from today? If you enjoy powerful neighborhood mysteries with emotional endings, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Because every street has a secret, and the next one may change the way you see your own neighborhood forever.